Hello once again, everyone. So, because we're kind of in between series, I wanted to take a moment to kind of go on, not necessarily a little ramble, but just go over a thought that's been kicking around in my head that some people might find interesting. So, I have here two swords that are very different from each other. In my left hand is my Albion Meyer. You would have seen it in plenty of videos. It's kind of my go-to sparring sword. And in my right hand is a Regenier Standard that actually belongs to one of our long ago members who's just kind of left us here for us to use. Dalton, if you're out there, we do miss you. But I recently sparred with this guy, and it kind of reinvigorated some memories / some things I used to do when I fought with a different sword. And I wanted to go over these two, not in regards to a comparison, but more in regards to looking at the tools that are at my disposal when I use one versus the other, and going over how that does slightly change the way I fight. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to be sitting here saying, oh, you can't do Fiore with this sword because it's too late a period or blah, 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 or anything along those lines. What this is more about is talking about just, what is available when I hold one versus the other, and how does that inform what techniques of mine I feel best doing. So, let's go ahead and start off with the Meyer. This one is kind of my standard. I fight with this the most. It certainly is, in my opinion, about what I want out of a longsword. At least for the majority of the time. It's comfortable enough in weight and balance point that I can use it in one hand. Not that I'm going to exclusively do so, but especially in grappling actions or things along those lines, this is very, very comfortable for me. It falls directly within the measurement that I use for a sword, that being, if I put my left hand on my opponent, I can withdraw my arm back and have that tip in front of target. It also, in general, is a slightly lighter sword. Now, I don't mean in regards to physical weight. The physical weight between these two is not that different, but more in regards to when I bind with something, if I am not being very conscious of using my edge against theirs correctly, this sword will flex without much, without much difficulty. As such, when I come into bind against heavier blades, I need to make sure I am either getting that edge alignment perfect, or I am putting myself behind it so that I am compensating for that, which, in regards to working with sharps, a lot of the sharps are thinner. Not necessarily all of them, but they will flex a lot more than you expect them to. And so this simulates that very well. Now, in regards to the techniques that I like to use, because it is kind of a bit more of a middle ground sword, I'll tend to fight both at range and relatively close, but usually in this sort of middle area where I'm just at my main extension, but not my maximum extension. So, for example, there's a lot of different kind of techniques I usually like. I will hold Nebenhut / Codalonga a lot with this guy, as it's very comfortable for me to pass into or alternatively defend with. I'm a big fan of Hagenort with this guy because it's light enough that I can very easily seek different targets, but it also encourages me when a cut comes in, rather than standing and fighting, it tends to encourage me to deflect out and cut or things along those lines. It's very good at deflecting up from below, especially because more often than not, with this cut, I will end up relatively close to people, so I got to be ready to do that. Because of its lightness, it's quite good in thumb grip techniques in general. However, because of its length, it can travel very quickly, and so I often find that I'll end up in relatively close fights, and then I'll end up getting this situation for coming over with a left Sverk or left Ober, which I try to prevent myself from doing that because I've gotten very good at it and it kind of sucks to get hit by. But with this length of sword, I can have someone binding very close to me and still get my maximum rotation without necessarily needing to spring out all that far, which is quite nice. Another thing this sword is particularly encouraging of when I use it is going to be, it mixes both styles that I do very well. And by that I mean that when I'm using this, I tend to adhere to either using my Meisterhau, etc., always passing with my strikes and keeping my body lined up, but also on the same vein, it's very good for standing and fighting with Fiore, either in regards to reserving my right leg for actions like that, or alternatively, it's also great length for if I close into the close range game, it's right where I want it to be. So really, this one's kind of hard to explain because it lends so well into what I've already shown of how I like to use a sword that it should kind of speak for itself. So let's now go over to the differences. Now, when I use this guy, this Regnier Standard, things do change a bit. Not that I can't do all of what I just talked about, but my tools have altered. Especially, and it starts pretty much with the grip. Now, what's important to remember is that when I used to fight in competition, back way before COVID actually even, I did use a longer sword, and I affectionately referred to it as a Schlagschwert, so a war sword, and that was my Chablowski Standard. That guy was heavier and not too dissimilar in length from this, but in general, when it came to those sorts of things, I did want a slightly longer, heavier sword because I was in competition. Why would I not, right? And my fighting at the time reflected it, so picking this up kind of reminded me of some old things. Not to say that this is, just a tournament sword, just that certain things are a little more available. So firstly, with the longer grip, I will take a lower down hand position and go ahead and use that big lever to really aid in my ability to ball and socket cut. Since I'm not going to be as up close as I am before, I don't need to compensate with using body position as much, and so my hands can move a little bit more independently of my body, almost more like the way I'd fight with a one-handed sword. This also lends into, with that longer blade, I tend to lead with the tip a little bit more, and since this guy is a lot stiffer, because it's overall a chunkier blade, especially when it comes to things like shields or what have you, boom, I'll really lead with that point, and I can snipe it in pretty well. Other things that I'll tend to do with this guy is I'll do a lot more high, either falsos coming from both sides, or I will also combo cuts together like that with a cut without step followed by a cut with step. Just in general, when I pick up this sword, it tends to invoke in me the idea of fighting with more of a battlefield weapon. Not to say that it has to, but a lot more of my polearm stuff comes out, a lot more of the idea of staying back comes out, not that I can't enter in, and certainly a lot more longer range point work, which is further encouraged by those side rings. Now, side rings are a bit of a controversial subject within sword preference. I don't mind them. Do I think it's something you should rely on? No. Do I think it's something that you can use? Sure, Just train with and without, and like any additive to the sword, it's just another aspect of it. Something that I definitely use the side rings a lot more for is the idea of on the thrust. So without side rings, I'd be very conscientious of where I put that cross guard. But with side rings, it actually allows me to do kind of messer-like things because I can use the side rings like a novel, especially when I do thrusts. Like that shield how, boom. I can more focus on catching that strike into this area on my guard, freeing my tip to go deeper into target. I can be a little more daring with holding my arms out there because they have to get around those side rings to target my hand. And in general, while it is a tool I will actively use, more often than not, it just becomes a nice bonus. Something a little bit more, like I said, suited to fighting out here and away from me. And just in general, I tend to try and keep this one moving a lot more. I keep my body behind it, but I'm fighting much more extended, tend to be seeking with the tip or harassing a lot more. And these are things that this sword encourages in me. That's not to say I can't do that with the other sword, just that when I picked this up, that's kind of what clicked. And I just found it interesting and decided to kind of talk about it. Now, what is, kind of the idea behind these two? What should I do, etc.? Can I learn anything from this? Well, I would say something to be aware of is that the way you differentiate your preferences. I like both swords. I like the way I fight with both swords. Certainly it's kind of the same as like switching hands. You think of yourself as kind of one being, but every time you pick up a different weapon or different properties of a weapon, it's going to encourage different behaviors in you, more so than anything else, right? You can go for the whole, one mind, so many weapons, and I do agree with that, but different parts of you will be brought to the forefront depending upon what you pick up, and that's very apparent in swords. And as such, the way I like to differentiate these two is this is much more comfortable as my day carry. It's much more comfortable as the true sidearm versus this just tends to invoke a bit more of a main arm, right? The Schlagschwert, the just general more battlefieldy stuff, and the techniques kind of reflect that. Maybe it's just deep pontification, but I do think it worthwhile that everyone at some point trains with extreme differences of sword. And sometimes they can be even more minor differences. Like, for example, going from a Regagné standard with side rings to just a Regagné light without side rings can be a pretty significant difference without really going that far away from home. You know, training with a heavier blade, training with a lighter blade, training with a longer blade, the points of balance, side rings, no side rings, etc. Even sometimes just length of crossguard could be a big difference. If you look, that crossguard on my Meyer is longer by a decent margin, and that does change the way I use it. And sometimes it even just comes down to, you know, how the tip bends, etc. Like I said, the Meyer is lighter, and so when I bind, I have to make sure it's all in my favor. I kind of get away hanging out in a bind with the Regagné. And just seeing what techniques that then leads into, because overall, the goal of this is to become a more complete fencer. So if I find myself picking this up, I know how I will fight. If I find myself picking up the other, I know how I will fight. And that's important to recognize in yourself, because then you can start passing on either helpful advice or even challenging yourself. So for example, you know, maybe someone in the school is pretty good at fighting me when I'm using my Meyer, because they fight me with it all the time, but when I pick up this guy, all of a sudden they don't know what to do with me. Did the sword magically make me better? Probably not. But instead, did the sword encourage me to fight differently, and they haven't adapted that game? Probably. There is no, you know, magical tool you can pick up and all of a sudden you just start winning all your bouts. Or alternatively, you've been fighting with this for a long time and you're not really getting challenged. Maybe try taking away some of the pieces of that and see how your game plan still holds up. Just a different way of challenging yourself and, in theory, increasing your ability. But otherwise, like I said, swords are awesome. And I encourage everyone to use as many as they can. But hopefully that was an interesting video. Wanted to just go over it, kind of pontificate, and maybe share your thoughts in the comments down below. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and we'll go over some other sword talk and techniques another time.